Every soul that the world calls worthless is being watched by someone fate has not introduced yet. Snow drifted silently through the towering pines, covering the forgotten corner of Blackridge Forest, where a lonely cabin stood beneath the weight of another long winter. Its roof sagged beneath fresh powder, its chimney released a thin ribbon of smoke into the pale afternoon sky, and no wagon had stopped there in months. Most wolves in Hollow Creek Pack pretended the cabin didn't exist. The few who passed by only shook their heads before walking faster, whispering the same words they had repeated for years. Rejected Omega. Unwanted. Unclaimed. Evelyn Brooks had long since stopped correcting them. Some battles only stole warmth from a heart already struggling against the cold. Every morning before sunrise she gathered firewood, fetched water from the frozen creek nearly half a mile away, mended worn blankets, and baked whatever simple bread she could make from the little flour she earned sewing torn clothing for families who barely thanked her. It wasn't much of a life, but it was peaceful enough if she ignored the silence that settled over the cabin each evening. Yet there was one secret that made those evenings feel less empty. Just before dusk, Evelyn always filled a small wooden bowl with warm broth, crumbled bits of fresh bread into it, wrapped herself in her faded gray cloak, and quietly slipped out the back door. She never carried a lantern. She knew the path by heart. 20 careful steps through untouched snow brought her to a weathered tree stump beside a cluster of frost-covered ferns. There she gently placed the bowl on the ground before stepping back, without saying a word. At first, nothing ever happened. Only the whisper of wind weaving through bare branches answered her. Then, from the shadows beneath a fallen cedar, 2 golden eyes slowly appeared. The little black wolf pup emerged with cautious movements, its small paws leaving delicate prints across the snow. Its coat had grown thicker since the first night she found it shivering beneath broken branches weeks ago, but it was still much too thin for winter. One ear carried a tiny notch that made it easy to recognize, and despite all the days that had passed, it never allowed anyone except Evelyn to come close. She smiled softly as the little creature lowered its head and began eating. "Take your time," she whispered. "There's enough today." The pup paused only long enough to glance up at her before continuing its meal, as though it understood every word. Evelyn had named it Ash because the black fur reminded her of warm fireplace ashes after the flames faded. She never wondered where it had come from anymore. Some questions didn't need answers if kindness could keep them alive one more day. Back inside Hollow Creek, however, stories spread faster than winter storms. Hunters claimed rogue wolves had been seen crossing nearby ridges. Ranchers complained about missing chickens and frightened horses. Elders warned everyone to keep their doors locked after sunset. Whenever someone mentioned strange tracks near the forest, another voice inevitably laughed. "Maybe that lonely Omega has started feeding monsters now." The others chuckled before changing the subject, never imagining their careless joke was closer to the truth than any of them realized. Evelyn heard those whispers every week in the marketplace, yet she simply lowered her eyes, accepted her basket of supplies, and walked home alone. She refused to let bitterness replace compassion. As twilight settled across the forest once again, Ash finished the last drop of broth before lifting its head. Instead of disappearing immediately into the trees, the little wolf stared beyond Evelyn's shoulder. Its ears stood alert. Its body became perfectly still. A low breeze carried a scent so unfamiliar that even Evelyn instinctively turned toward the endless line of dark pines. Far away, hidden beyond the falling snow, something was moving through the forest with quiet purpose, and for the very first time since Ash had appeared outside her cabin, the little wolf did not run from the approaching darkness. The little wolf remained frozen until the distant sound faded back into the endless whisper of the forest. Only then did Ash relax, letting out a slow breath before nudging the empty wooden bowl with its nose. Evelyn crouched carefully, smiling as she reached out. This time, instead of stepping away, the pup moved closer on its own. Its soft black fur brushed against her fingertips for the first time. The tiny gesture warmed her more deeply than the fire waiting inside the cabin ever could. "You are beginning to trust me," she whispered, scratching gently behind its ear. I promise I will never give you a reason not to. Ash closed its bright golden eyes for only a second before opening them again, alert as always. The little wolf constantly listened to sounds Evelyn could never hear, lifting its head whenever distant branches shifted or unfamiliar scents drifted through the trees. It behaved less like an abandoned cub and more like someone carrying an invisible responsibility far beyond its age. Evelyn noticed the strange habit, but never questioned it. Whatever had happened before the pup found her was part of a story it could not tell. She simply accepted that every frightened creature deserved one place, where it did not have to explain its past. Over the following days, their quiet routine became the one steady rhythm in her lonely life. Every afternoon, she saved the freshest scraps from her own meal before preparing a small pot of broth flavored with vegetables and herbs growing near the creek whenever the season allowed. Some evenings she spoke softly while Ash ate, telling simple stories about clouds that looked like sailing ships, the robin that returned to the same pine every spring, or the dream she once had of seeing mountains beyond Hollow Creek. She laughed once, embarrassed by herself. You probably understand none of this. Ash tilted its head as if politely disagreeing. The tiny reaction made Evelyn smile again. She had forgotten what smiling every day felt like before the little wolf wandered into her life. Meanwhile, Hollow Creek grew increasingly restless. Fresh tracks appeared after every snowfall. Hunters claimed they belonged to unusually large wolves, larger than any rogue pack should possess. At the general store, conversations stopped whenever Evelyn entered, only to resume in hushed voices after she left. Something is watching us. One rancher muttered. I found prints nearly twice the size of my hand. Another nodded grimly. 5 sets, always together. They never come close enough to be seen. Evelyn listened quietly while paying for a small sack of potatoes and dried beans. She lowered her gaze and slipped outside before anyone noticed the worry crossing her face. 5 wolves. The number lingered in her thoughts during the entire walk home. She tried convincing herself it was only coincidence. Ash was small, gentle, harmless. Whatever prowled the distant ridges could not possibly have anything to do with the little companion waiting beside her cabin. Yet that evening, when she stepped outside carrying the familiar wooden bowl, Ash did not greet her from beneath the fallen cedar. The clearing stood silent. Snow rested untouched across the ground. Ash, she called gently. No answer came except the wind. Her heart tightened as she searched between the trees, following the tiny paw prints she knew so well until they suddenly disappeared beneath larger tracks pressed deep into the fresh snow. She slowly knelt beside them, placing one trembling hand inside the nearest print. It was enormous, far wider than her palm. 5 separate trails surrounded the smaller paw prints before leading into the dark forest together. Evelyn remained perfectly still, staring at the fading path while the last light disappeared behind the pines. Somewhere beyond those silent trees, unseen eyes were already watching the lonely cabin, waiting for the moment when their long search would finally come to an end. Evelyn barely slept that night. Every gust of winter wind against the cabin walls sounded like cautious footsteps circling just beyond the darkness. Before dawn, she wrapped herself in her gray cloak and stepped outside again, hoping to find the familiar little tracks leading back to the cedar. Instead, she found only fresh snow stretching across the clearing like an untouched white blanket. The enormous paw prints from the evening before had vanished beneath the snowfall as though the forest itself had chosen to hide every clue. She stood quietly listening to the silence. Ash, she called once more, her voice, barely louder than the breeze. Nothing answered. A strange emptiness settled inside her chest. She carried the wooden bowl to the old tree stump anyway, filling it with warm broth before returning to the cabin. If Ash came back while she was away gathering water, she wanted the little wolf to know someone was still waiting. Later that morning, Hollow Creek buzzed with uneasy conversation. A hunting party had returned after following unusual tracks deep into Blackridge Forest. They had not found the animals responsible, but everyone agreed on one thing. Whatever had crossed the mountains was unlike anything seen before. Some believed an ancient wolf clan had returned after decades of hiding. Others whispered about royal scouts traveling in secret. Fear and imagination blended together until every rumor sounded believable. Evelyn quietly purchased flour, dried apples, and lamp oil before beginning the long walk home. As she passed the old chapel, she noticed several children gathered near the frozen well. One little boy looked up at her with innocent curiosity. "Miss Brooks," he asked, "is it true the forest wolves protect good people?" His mother immediately pulled him closer, offering Evelyn an apologetic smile before hurrying away without waiting for an answer. Evelyn watched them disappear down the snowy road. She wished the world still believed kindness could invite protection instead of danger. By afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the mountains, bringing another steady snowfall. Evelyn stacked more firewood beside the door before carrying a fresh bowl outside exactly as she had every day for weeks. She placed it carefully on the familiar stump and waited. Minutes slipped by. Snowflakes landed on her sleeves, melting slowly against the worn fabric. She almost turned back toward the cabin when she heard a soft crunch somewhere behind the cedar. "Ash," she whispered hopefully. A tiny black nose appeared first, followed by two bright golden eyes peeking from beneath low branches. Relief rushed through her so suddenly that she laughed aloud. "There you are." The little wolf emerged cautiously, though something had changed. Ash looked cleaner than before. The dullness had vanished from its thick black coat, and its posture carried an unexpected confidence. Around its neck rested a narrow leather cord Evelyn had never seen before. Hanging from it was a small silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. She frowned gently. "Where did you get that?" Ash simply wagged its tail before eating as though nothing unusual had happened. Evelyn reached toward the pendant, but the pup took one playful step backward, almost teasing her. She smiled despite her confusion. Keeping secrets now. Ash finished the last bite before suddenly lifting its head toward the forest. Its ears stood straight. Every playful expression disappeared. Without warning, the little wolf hurried several yards away before looking back at Evelyn. It barked once, softly but urgently, then repeated the motion as though asking her to follow. Evelyn hesitated only a moment before stepping into the untouched snow behind the mysterious little guide, unaware that hidden high among the silent pines, 5 pairs of watchful golden eyes were observing every step she took with quiet patience. Ash moved with surprising confidence, weaving through narrow paths hidden beneath heavy pine branches where no ordinary traveler would have thought to walk. Evelyn followed as quickly as she could, lifting the hem of her cloak to keep it from catching on frozen roots buried beneath the snow. The forest felt different today. Even the birds had fallen strangely quiet, as though every living creature sensed something important approaching. Several times, she thought she caught movement between distant trees, dark shapes slipping silently beyond sight, but each time she looked directly, there was nothing except drifting snow and endless rows of ancient pines. "You are taking me farther than usual," she said with a gentle smile, trying to hide the nervous flutter growing inside her chest. Ash glanced back, its bright golden eyes meeting hers for only a moment before continuing deeper into the woods. After nearly 20 minutes, the little wolf suddenly stopped beside a narrow ravine where a fallen oak stretched across the gap like a natural bridge. Beneath the tree, partially hidden, under fresh snow, Evelyn noticed something unexpected. A heavy iron snare had been fastened between 2 thick roots. The chain attached to it disappeared beneath the frozen ground, carefully concealed by branches and leaves. Her heart sank. Someone from the pack had set traps in this part of the forest. She looked at Ash with growing concern. "Were you trying to warn me?" The little wolf stepped toward the hidden snare before carefully placing one paw beside it without touching the metal. Only then did Evelyn notice several black strands of fur caught against the edge of the trap. They looked fresh. She knelt slowly, brushing away snow until the mechanism became visible. "If you had stepped 1 inch closer," she whispered, unable to finish the thought. Working carefully with both hands, she loosened the frozen latch until the heavy jaws released with a dull click. She pushed the trap aside as far as she could before standing again. Ash approached immediately, rubbing its head gently against her hand as though offering thanks. Evelyn smiled softly. "No one should have to fear a meal or a walk through the woods. As she stroked the little wolf's neck, her fingers once again brushed against the silver crescent pendant. This time, she noticed delicate markings engraved across its surface, symbols unlike anything she had ever seen in Hollow Creek. Before she could study them more closely, Ash lifted its head sharply toward the northern ridge. The playful warmth disappeared from its expression. A deep silence settled across the forest. Even the wind seemed to pause between the trees. Then, far in the distance, a long, low howl floated through the snowy air. It was calm, steady, and strangely beautiful. Ash answered with a much softer call that barely rose above a whisper. Evelyn had never heard the little wolf make a sound like that before. Moments later, another distant howl echoed from a different direction. Then another. And another. 5 voices in total, each separated by only a few seconds, surrounding the forest without ever sounding threatening. The calls felt less like warnings and more like a conversation carried across the mountains. Ash stood perfectly still, listening with complete attention before lowering its head respectfully. Evelyn frowned. "Your family is looking for you, are they?" The little wolf looked at her with eyes that seemed far older than any young creature should possess. It took one slow step closer before resting its forehead gently against her arm. Evelyn instinctively wrapped both hands around the pup, holding it close against the winter cold. "If they come for you," she whispered, "I will be happy because you will not be alone anymore." For the first time since she had met Ash, the little wolf did not seem relieved by her kindness. Instead, it remained completely still in her embrace, while beyond the snow-covered ridges 5 unseen guardians silently changed their course and began moving together toward the lonely cabin waiting at the edge of Blackridge Forest. The walk back to the cabin felt quieter than any evening Evelyn could remember. Snow continued drifting through the fading light, covering their footprints almost as quickly as they appeared. Ash stayed unusually close to her side, never wandering ahead as it normally did. Every few moments, the little wolf glanced toward the surrounding forest, its golden eyes following movements invisible to human sight. Evelyn noticed the change, but chose not to ask questions that could never be answered. Some truths revealed themselves only when they were ready. By the time the cabin came into view, the first stars had begun appearing above the dark mountain ridge. Warm light glowed through the frosted windows, making the tiny home look almost magical against the endless, white landscape. Evelyn smiled softly. "Home," she whispered. Ash paused before crossing the clearing. Instead of running toward the familiar tree stump, the little wolf stood perfectly still, facing the forest behind them. Its ears lifted, its tail lowered, not in fear, but in expectation. Then the silence broke. Slow footsteps compressed fresh snow somewhere beyond the line of pines. One pair, then another, then several more, all moving with calm, measured confidence. Evelyn instinctively turned. Between the ancient trees, 5 enormous black wolves emerged one after another. Moonlight shimmered across their thick coats, giving them the appearance of living shadows. Each one stood taller than any wolf Evelyn had ever imagined, their posture proud and composed. They did not bare their teeth. They did not growl. They simply walked forward until they reached the edge of the clearing, then stopped together as though following a silent command. Evelyn's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it inside her ears, yet something deep inside told her not to run. There was no anger in their golden eyes. Only purpose. Ash stepped away from her slowly. The little wolf walked halfway across the clearing before sitting calmly in the snow. The 5 great wolves lowered their heads in unison. Evelyn blinked, certain she had imagined what she had just seen. "They are greeting you," she whispered in disbelief. Ash answered with a quiet, cheerful bark before looking back at her. The expression in those bright eyes was almost encouraging, as if asking her not to be afraid. The largest wolf, whose fur carried faint streaks of silver along its shoulders, took one careful step forward. Every movement reflected discipline rather than threat. It lowered its head respectfully toward Evelyn before stopping several yards away. She stood frozen beside the cabin door, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. Finally, she managed a small smile. "If you came for him, Then he has been waiting for you. The great wolf remained motionless. The others did not move either. The clearing became so quiet that Evelyn could hear snowflakes landing softly upon the roof. Ash looked from the 5 wolves back to Evelyn several times before trotting toward her once more. Instead of leaving with them, the little wolf leaned gently against her boots, refusing to move farther. Evelyn knelt beside it and stroked the soft black fur between its ears. "You do not have to choose tonight," she whispered kindly. "You have always been free." For a long moment nothing changed. Then every one of the 5 wolves slowly turned their gaze away from Ash and focused entirely on Evelyn. Their expressions softened with unmistakable respect. She felt her breath catch. Whatever she had expected, it was not this. It was as though the mysterious visitors had not come to take something away from her at all. They had come because of her. Before she could understand why, all 5 wolves suddenly lifted their heads toward the distant mountain road. A faint rumble echoed through the winter air, steady and deliberate, growing closer with every passing second. Even Ash straightened immediately, his tail beginning to wag with quiet excitement while the 5 silent guardians stepped aside, forming a perfect path, leading directly to the lonely cabin as someone important approached through the snow. The distant rumble grew louder until a long black carriage emerged from the snow-covered road beyond the trees, its wheels moving smoothly despite the heavy winter drifts. 4 magnificent black horses pulled it with effortless strength, their polished harnesses reflecting the pale moonlight. The moment the carriage reached the edge of the clearing, it came to a gentle stop without a single shouted command. The 5 enormous wolves lowered their heads once again. Evelyn had never witnessed such perfect discipline. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the edge of her cloak as she watched the carriage door open. Before anyone stepped out, 2 men dressed in dark traveling cloaks descended first. Their movements were calm, precise, and unmistakably practiced. Each carried himself with quiet confidence rather than arrogance. They looked toward the 5 wolves and exchanged a single nod before turning their attention to the small black pup standing beside Evelyn. One of them smiled with visible relief. "Thank the moon," he whispered softly. "We finally found him." Evelyn blinked in surprise. "You know Ash?" Both men looked at one another for a brief moment before the older of the 2 approached with slow, careful steps, stopping several feet away so as not to frighten either Evelyn or the little wolf. "Miss," he said respectfully, placing one hand over his heart, "we owe you more gratitude than words can express." Evelyn looked down at Ash, then back toward the strangers. "I think you have mistaken me for someone else." The man gently shook his head.
"No, we
have searched across mountains, valleys, and forests for many weeks. Every trail ended in silence until tonight." Ash trotted happily toward the older man, who knelt immediately and stroked the little wolf behind the ears with obvious affection. Instead of lifting the pup into his arms, however, he simply smiled. "You have grown stronger, young one." Ash answered with an excited bark before immediately running back to Evelyn's side again. The older man's warm expression turned thoughtful. "He still chooses to stand beside you." Evelyn felt increasingly confused. "I only gave him food and a warm place to rest." "Sometimes," the man replied quietly, "those are the greatest gifts anyone can receive." Behind them, the 5 black wolves suddenly shimmered beneath the moonlight. Evelyn stepped back in astonishment as each magnificent wolf gradually shifted into human form. Moments later, 5 tall men dressed in elegant black uniforms stood where the wolves had been only seconds before. Silver wolf emblems gleamed across their cloaks, and each carried the calm bearing of highly trained royal guardians. Without speaking, all 5 placed one knee upon the snow. Their synchronized gesture left Evelyn completely speechless. The older man bowed his head slightly toward her. "Please forgive us for arriving without warning. These are the Royal Blackguard." Evelyn stared at the kneeling figures, then looked down at Ash, who appeared completely unsurprised by any of it. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Who is this little wolf?" Before anyone could answer, every member of the Royal Blackguard rose smoothly to their feet and turned toward the carriage once more. The air itself seemed to change. Even the falling snow appeared softer as another figure slowly stepped down onto the white ground. He was tall, composed, and dressed in a long charcoal coat trimmed with silver embroidery that caught the moonlight without excessive display. His dark hair moved gently in the winter breeze, while calm gray eyes surveyed the clearing with quiet confidence. There was nothing loud about his presence, yet every person there instinctively gave him space. Ash's entire face brightened with unmistakable joy. The little wolf bounded across the snow before stopping only inches from the newcomer. Instead of calling the pup, the man simply knelt and opened one arm. Ash hurried forward without hesitation. The stranger smiled with genuine warmth before lifting the little wolf into a gentle embrace. Then his gaze slowly lifted until it met Evelyn's eyes for the very first time, and in that single silent moment, it felt as though the entire winter forest had been waiting for this meeting all along. For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. Snow drifted gently between them, softening the edges of the silent clearing until the entire forest seemed to disappear beyond the white veil. The man lowered the little wolf carefully to the ground, and Ash immediately settled beside his boots before glancing back toward Evelyn with the same trusting eyes that had greeted her every evening outside the cabin. The stranger noticed the gesture, and a faint smile touched his face. It was not the smile of someone amused. It was the smile of someone deeply relieved. "So," he said at last, his calm voice carrying easily through the winter air, "you are Evelyn Brooks." She nodded cautiously. "Yes. I am Lucian Ashford." The name settled over the clearing like another snowfall. Evelyn searched her memory, but living alone at the edge of Hollow Creek meant she rarely followed stories from distant kingdoms or noble families. To her, he was simply a courteous stranger whose presence somehow commanded effortless respect from everyone around him. Before she could ask another question, the older guard stepped forward and bowed his head. "Your Majesty, the search is finally complete." Evelyn's eyes widened. She slowly looked from the guard back to Lucian. "Your Majesty?" Lucian answered with a small nod that carried no pride, only quiet acceptance. "I serve as Alpha King of the Northern Territories." Evelyn felt her breath catch. She had heard countless stories about the Alpha King throughout her childhood. Some described a fearless ruler. Others painted him as distant and impossible to approach. None of those stories matched the composed man standing peacefully outside her cabin. She instinctively lowered her gaze. "I did not know." "You were never expected to," Lucian replied gently. "Please do not feel uncomfortable because of a title." Ash walked back toward Evelyn once again, sitting beside her boots before leaning lightly against her leg. Lucian watched the little wolf with unmistakable affection. He always chooses honesty over ceremony. Evelyn smiled as she scratched behind Ash's ear. "He has always done whatever his heart wanted." The Alpha King gave a quiet laugh. "That is a family trait." Evelyn looked up in confusion. Lucian's expression softened even further. "You have called him Ash. It is a good name." He paused for a brief moment before continuing. "But the truth is he is Prince Aiden Ashford, my son." The world seemed to stand completely still. Evelyn stared at the little wolf in disbelief before looking back at Lucian. "Your son?" Lucian nodded. Several weeks ago, he wandered farther from the royal estate than anyone realized during a severe snowstorm. He slipped away while following a wounded bird. By the time the guards discovered he was missing, the weather had hidden every trail. One of the royal blackguards stepped forward respectfully. "We searched every forest, every village, and every mountain pass across the Northern Territories. We feared he had become hopelessly lost." Lucian's eyes returned to Evelyn. "Instead, someone found him first." Evelyn looked down at the little wolf, remembering the frightened pup trembling beneath broken branches on that freezing night. "He was hungry," she whispered. "He looked so alone." Lucian slowly walked closer until only a few feet separated them. Most people would have walked away, believing he was only another wild animal. Evelyn gently rested one hand on Ash's head. "I could not." The Alpha King studied her quietly, as though every story his guards had shared suddenly became real. Every report they gave me spoke of an Omega who never asked for a reward, never sought recognition, and never even tried to discover who he truly was. Evelyn lowered her eyes again. Kindness should not depend on someone's name. Those simple words lingered in the cold evening air. None of the royal blackguards spoke. Even the older advisor remained silent. Lucian looked toward his son, who happily leaned against Evelyn once more despite standing only steps away from his own father. A gentle smile returned to the Alpha King's face. "It seems," he said softly, "that my son trusted your heart long before he knew mine would find him again." The quiet that followed felt warmer than the fire glowing inside the little cabin. No one hurried to leave. No one reached to take Prince Aiden away before he was ready. Instead, the young wolf wandered comfortably between his father and Evelyn, as though both belonged within the same peaceful moment. Lucian watched his son with unmistakable relief. The deep worry that had hidden behind his calm expression slowly faded, replaced by gratitude that seemed difficult to put into words. Finally, he looked back toward Evelyn. "May I ask you something?" She nodded. "Of course. When you first found him, did you recognize the royal crest on his pendant?" Evelyn gently shook her head. "I noticed it only recently. I thought perhaps it belonged to the family that lost him. I hoped they would find him before winter became harsher." One of the royal blackguards smiled quietly. "She never removed it, Your Majesty." Another added, "She protected both the prince and the royal seal without knowing either one's value." Lucian lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again. Many people would have hidden that pendant or attempted to learn what reward it might bring. Evelyn looked genuinely surprised. "It was never mine to keep." Her answer was so immediate that even the older royal advisor allowed himself a small smile. "That is precisely why it remained safe." Ash suddenly trotted toward the cabin door before stopping and looking back expectantly. Evelyn laughed softly. "He usually asks for another bowl of broth before sleeping." The little prince answered with an eager bark that made several members of the Royal Black Guard exchange amused glances. Lucian chuckled for the first time that evening. Some habits survive every royal lesson. Evelyn opened the cabin door and invited them inside to escape the growing cold. The modest room held little more than a wooden table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and neatly folded blankets resting beside a small bookshelf. Everything was simple, carefully repaired, and immaculately clean. Lucian slowly looked around without saying a word. Nothing inside suggested wealth or comfort, yet every corner reflected kindness and quiet dignity. A small woven basket near the fireplace caught his attention. Inside rested several handmade toys carved from fallen branches. Tiny wooden birds, a rabbit, a wolf no larger than his hand. "You made these?" he asked. Evelyn nodded while placing another pot of broth over the fire. During long winters, sometimes children from the village stop by after losing a favorite toy. Their parents cannot always afford another one. Lucian gently picked up the little carved wolf, studying the careful details shaped into the wood. "And you never asked for payment?" Evelyn smiled faintly. Seeing someone smile has always been enough. The Alpha King remained silent for a long moment. Everything his guards had reported suddenly became visible before his own eyes. The rejected Omega whom others overlooked possessed a generosity that no title could purchase. Prince Aiden happily finished another bowl before curling up beside Evelyn's chair exactly as he had done every evening since arriving at the cabin. Lucian watched the scene with quiet amazement. "He has attendants, tutors, and protectors at the palace," he said softly. "Yet I have not seen him sleep this peacefully in many months." Evelyn lowered one hand to gently stroke the little wolf's back. Perhaps he simply needed to feel safe. Lucian met her eyes again, and for the first time there was no distance between a king and an ordinary Omega. There was only sincere respect. "Miss Brooks," he said warmly, "you believed you rescued a lonely wolf pup. The truth is much greater than that. You reminded a frightened child that kindness still exists in this world. That is a gift even a king cannot repay with gold, titles, or promises." As the fire crackled gently beside them, Prince Aiden opened one sleepy eye, looked from his father too. Evelyn, and gave a content little sigh, completely unaware that his innocent choice had already begun changing far more than one family's future. Morning sunlight spilled across the snow like liquid gold, transforming the quiet clearing into something almost dreamlike. For the first time in many years, Evelyn stepped outside her cabin and did not feel invisible. Prince Aiden bounded happily through the fresh snow before circling back to her with playful excitement, inviting her to join his morning game one last time. She laughed as he gently nudged her hand, and the sound carried across the peaceful forest. Lucian watched from nearby, his expression calm but thoughtful. He had spent his entire life learning how to judge strength by power, leadership, and courage in battle. Yet standing before the humble cabin, he realized the greatest strength he had witnessed was found in a woman who had quietly chosen compassion every single day when no one was watching. As the Royal Black Guard prepared the carriage for departure, the older advisor approached Evelyn with respectful courtesy. "Miss Brooks, His Majesty wishes to extend an invitation. If you should ever need assistance, the gates of Ashford Palace will always remain open to you." Evelyn looked surprised. "I only did what I hoped someone would do for me if I were ever alone." The advisor smiled warmly. "That is exactly why the invitation matters." Lucian stepped forward, carrying a folded winter cloak woven from deep charcoal wool with a silver clasp shaped like a crescent moon. "Please accept this," he said. "Not as payment, because kindness should never be purchased, but as a reminder that your goodness will never again go unseen." Evelyn hesitated before accepting the gift with both hands. "Thank you." At that moment, Prince Aiden hurried back to her side and stood on his hind legs, placing his tiny front paws gently against her coat. She knelt to embrace him one final time. "Be brave," she whispered. "Listen to your father, eat your meals, and do not wander into snowstorms anymore." The little prince answered with a cheerful bark before licking her hand and racing happily back toward Lucian. The Alpha King smiled at his son before looking toward Evelyn once more. "He has met countless people since the day he was born," Lucian said softly. "Yet you are the first person he chose because of your heart rather than your title." Evelyn felt unexpected emotion rise inside her chest. "Then I think he will become a wonderful king someday." Lucian nodded slowly. "If he remembers what he learned here, I believe so too." As the carriage began moving toward the forest road, Prince Aiden leaned from the open doorway, watching Evelyn until the cabin became smaller in the distance. He lifted one little paw in what looked remarkably like a farewell wave. Evelyn laughed through grateful tears and returned the gesture. Long after the carriage disappeared beyond the snow-covered pines, she remained standing quietly in the clearing, wrapped in the warm cloak the Alpha King had given her. The forest no longer felt lonely. The silence no longer felt empty. Somewhere beyond the mountains lived a child who would always remember the woman who had shared her bread, her fire, and her kindness without ever asking who he was. And somewhere inside the palace, an Alpha King would forever remember that the person who protected the future of his kingdom was not the strongest warrior or the wealthiest noble, but a rejected Omega whose gentle heart saw value where everyone else saw nothing at all. Sometimes destiny does not arrive with thunder, crowns, or grand declarations. Sometimes it knocks softly on the door of a forgotten cabin disguised as a hungry little wolf, waiting for one compassionate soul to answer.